Did you know the most famous scene in this film was originally far worse, and that the first director hired to shoot it walked away because he could not hear himself say the word action? Misery arrived in 1990 looking like the cleanest thriller in years. 2 people, 1 bedroom, 1 blizzard. Underneath it sat a script that scared off half of Hollywood. More than a dozen leading men who said no, a novel written inside a serious drug addiction, and a star who spent 15 weeks pinned to a mattress. Some of this is strange. Some of it is genuinely dark. Here are 20 weird facts. Counting down. Number 20. 15 stars ran from the bed. Almost every major leading man in Hollywood read the part of Paul Sheldon and said no. William Hurt turned it down twice. Kevin Kline said no. Michael Douglas said no. So did Harrison Ford, Dustin Hoffman, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Richard Dreyfuss, Gene Hackman, and Robert Redford. In his book 4 Screenplays, screenwriter William Goldman lists even more names who passed, including Morgan Freeman, Mel Gibson, Denzel Washington, and Bruce Willis. The reason was simple, and it was not about quality. Paul Sheldon spends most of the story flat on his back, drugged, terrified, and unable to run. Leading men of that era were sold on control. Chases, fists, charm. This part offered a wheelchair and a bedpan, and the other character owned every scene. Here's the crazy part. That refusal list became the movie's secret weapon. Because no obvious star would touch it, the film ended up with James Caan, an actor whose whole screen history was aggression, suddenly stripped of the ability to move. The audience feels that mismatch in every frame, and one of the men who said no came back for it years later. Bruce Willis eventually played Paul Sheldon on Broadway in 2015, in a stage version of the same story he had once passed on. A room full of stars ran from that bed. The film only worked because someone finally climbed into it. Number 19. Warren Beatty left his fingerprints. 1 star came very close, and he rewrote the hero before he vanished. Warren Beatty was seriously interested in Paul Sheldon. He met with Rob Reiner and William Goldman, and he did not want to play a man who simply lies there and suffers. He pushed for a Paul who fights, schemes, and thinks his way through the room, rather than a victim waiting for rescue. Then, the calendar killed it. Post-production on Dick Tracy ran long. Beatty was locked into it, and he had to drop out of Misery entirely. But his notes stayed. Watch the finished film again, and you can see the man he argued for. Paul tests the lock on his door. He counts Annie's pills. He hides a knife. He wheels himself out into the hallway and measures the width of the frame. He plays her ego like an instrument during the manuscript scenes. He is trapped, but he is never passive. That change matters more than it sounds. A helpless hero would have made the film a 2-hour torture wait. A scheming hero turns it into a chess game where one player cannot stand up. Beatty never shot a single scene in the movie. His version of the character is in almost all of them. Number 18. The director who could not say action misery cost a great director his nerve before the cameras ever rolled. George Roy Hill was one of the biggest names in American film, the man behind Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting and Slapshot. He agreed to direct Misery, and he already knew William Goldman well from those earlier hits. Then he sat down with a script that still contained the moment from the novel, where Annie takes an axe to Paul's foot and seals the wound with a torch. According to Goldman's account, Hill backed out, and his explanation has been quoted ever since. He said he had been up all night, and that he simply could not hear himself saying action on that scene. Stop and think about what that means. A filmmaker who had staged shootouts, cons, and hockey brawls read 1 page and decided he could not physically direct it. Not because it was badly written, because it was too much for him to put a crew through. So the producer stepped up. Rob Reiner, who had brought the project together, took the director's chair himself. The film exists because the man in charge of hiring a director ran out of directors. 1 scene emptied the room. The scene was not even the version audiences finally saw. Number 17. Anjelica Huston turned down Annie. The most celebrated role in the film was not an easy sell to actresses either. Anjelica Huston has said publicly that she was offered the part of Annie Wilkes and passed on it. She was a major name at the time, coming off award-winning work, and Annie was the opposite of a flattering showcase. No glamour. No sympathy safety net. A woman in a cardigan who breaks a man's legs and calls him a dirty birdie. That is a career risk, and several established performers treated it as one. Annie is not a monster with claws. She is a nurse with a pig, a scrapbook and a shotgun, and the actress playing her has to be completely believable as somebody's neighbor. Here is the twist. The very thing that made stars hesitate is what made the part immortal. Because no glamorous name attached, the filmmakers stopped chasing famous faces and started hunting for the best Annie, not the biggest Annie. Huston later spoke about the past with clear eyes. The role went on to win an Academy Award. She has been candid that she got that one wrong. Most missed opportunities in Hollywood fade quietly. This one plays on television every October, forever. Number 16, They Wanted a Face Nobody Knew. Casting an unknown was not a budget decision. It was strategy. Rob Reiner did not want the audience walking in with a famous face to hold on to. If a giant star plays Annie Wilkes, viewers relax because they know the star. They watch a performance instead of a person. Reiner wanted the opposite. He wanted a woman who looked like she could have carried you out of a snowbank in real life. Kathy Bates was that woman. She was respected in New York theater, admired by writers, and almost invisible to film audiences. Goldman has been credited with steering Reiner toward her, and once she read for the part, the argument ended. That choice changed the temperature of the entire movie. When Annie first appears, there is no star wattage warning you. She is warm. She is chatty. She feeds him soup. You have no reason to be scared of her, which is precisely why the turn lands like a hammer, and it changed film history in a way nobody planned. The unknown actress hired so audiences would not recognize her ended up creating one of the most recognizable characters in horror. They cast a stranger on purpose. She became the most familiar face in the story. Number 15. Hollywood kept taking her roles before Annie. Kathy Bates kept watching other women play her parts. On stage, she was formidable. She earned a Tony nomination for the Marcia Norman play Night Mother and an Obie Award for Terrence McNally's Frankie and Johnny in The Clair de Lune. She built both roles in front of live audiences, night after night. Then the film versions arrived. Sissy Spacek played the Night Mother role on screen. Michelle Pfeiffer played the Frankie and Johnny role. Bates was left on the outside of stories she had originated because studios wanted marquee names. That is one of the quiet cruelties of the business. It is not a feud or a scandal. It is a pattern, repeated until an actor learns the message about how they are seen. Here is the payoff. The one film role nobody was fighting her for was a middle-aged nurse who tortures a writer in a snowbound farmhouse. No studio pushed a bigger star into it, because no bigger star wanted it. She took the part that Hollywood did not consider worth stealing, and she won the Academy Award for Best Actress with it. For years, the industry replaced her. Then, it handed her the trophy. Number 14. King almost refused to sell Stephen King, had good reasons to keep this book away from filmmakers. By the middle of the 80s, King had watched his work turned into everything from masterpieces to disasters. And Misery was personal in a way most of his novels were not. It is about a writer being punished by a reader. Handing that to a studio is like handing over a diary. What changed his mind was Stand By Me. Rob Reiner's 1986 film came from King's novella The Body, and King has spoken about how much that adaptation meant to him. Long-standing production accounts say he agreed to sell Misery on the condition that Reiner would either produce or direct it. That is a rare piece of leverage for an author. King was not asking for approval on posters. He was naming the one filmmaker he trusted with a story about his own worst fear, and the connection ran deeper than a handshake. Reiner's production company was called Castle Rock Entertainment, named after the fictional Maine town King had been writing about for years. The company, built partly on King's imagination, was the company he let take his most private novel. He had been burned before. This time he wrote his own protection into the deal. Number 13. The pen name that almost hit it, Misery, was supposed to arrive with somebody else's name on the cover. For years King had published under the alias Richard Bachman, a second identity that let him release darker, leaner books without the weight of the King brand. Misery, a bleak story about a captive writer, was planned as a Bachman book. Then the alias collapsed. In 1985, a bookstore clerk named Steve Brown went digging through publishing records and connected Bachman to King. Once it was public, the trick was over. King announced Bachman's death and moved on, and Misery was eventually published in 1987 under his real name. Here's the strange part. and it is almost too neat. Misery is a novel about a writer who cannot escape what his readers expect of him. Paul Sheldon wants to publish something new and gets punished for it. King wanted the same freedom, invented a second name to get it, and lost that hiding place before the book even reached shelves. So the story about a trapped author showed up under the one name its author had been trying to escape. He wrote about a writer with no way out. Then his own back door was found and closed. Number 12. A fake town in Nevada. The snowy Colorado town in this film is not in Colorado. Principal photography started in February of 1990, and the story is set in a fictional place called Silver Creek, Colorado. For the exteriors, the production went to Geno, Nevada, one of the oldest settlements in the state, and simply built the town it needed on the main street. Crews put up a cafe, a radiator shop, a sheriff's station, and a general store. None of them were real businesses. They were shells with signage, standing in a genuine mountain community so that the sheriff's subplot would feel like it belonged to a real place with real gossip. That detail matters more than typical location trivia, because the outside world in Misery does almost all of the suspense work. Every cut away from the bedroom needs to feel ordinary. A coffee counter, a slow conversation, two old people talking about a missing writer. If those beats look like a set, the tension dies. Here is the twist. The film is remembered as a claustrophobic two-hander shot inside a bedroom, and the crew was out in freezing mountain weather nailing a false town together so that the bedroom would feel more trapped by contrast. The farmhouse felt like a cage because somebody built a whole town to be outside it. Number 11. A comedy director shot the horror the man behind the camera on Misery would later be known for jokes, not dread. Barry Sonnenfeld was the cinematographer. He had already shot Blood Simple and Raising Arizona for the Coen brothers, films full of wide lenses, low angles, and tension pushed to absurdity. Within a few years of Misery, he stopped shooting altogether and became a director, making The Addams Family and then Men in Black. That background explains a lot about how the film looks. Misery is not shot like a gritty thriller. It is shot like a trap. Doorways box Paul in. Furniture sits between him and the exit. The camera crowds Annie in close up until her cheerfulness feels wrong, then pulls back so the house looms. Here is the crazy part. That same instinct, the slightly heightened, almost comic framing, is what makes Annie funny before she is frightening. Audiences laugh at the Penguin, the scrapbook, and the Liberace records. Then the laughter becomes a problem, because they have been laughing along with a killer. The visual grammar of a dark comedy was aimed at a captivity story, and it made the Horrorland twice as hard. The eye that later launched blockbuster comedy first locked a man in one room and turned the key. Number 10. Reiner went to Hitchcock school. The director of this thriller had never made a thriller in his life. Rob Reiner's track record was This Is Spinal Tap, The Sure Thing, Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, and When Harry Met Sally. Comedy, warmth, nostalgia, nothing about a woman with a sledgehammer. So he studied. Reiner worked his way through Alfred Hitchcock's films to learn how suspense is actually built, shot by shot, rather than guessing at it. That is where the film's patience comes from. Misery withholds. It lets you notice things before Paul does, and the pressure showed. James Caan has recounted overhearing Reiner on set, scolding himself out loud, asking who he thought he was, Alfred Hitchcock. That one moment tells you everything about the mood of the shoot. The director had a hit comedy behind him, a horror novel in his hands, an amputation he had already cut from the script, and a lead actor who could not walk. The safety net was gone. Here's the payoff. The Hitchcock homework is visible in the most quoted sequences. Annie leaving the house, Paul out of the bedroom, the audience watching a hallway and doing the maths on how long he has. Nothing supernatural, just information, released slowly. A comedy director taught himself dread from old films and made one of the tightest thrillers of the decade. Number 9. The curse words that are not curse words. Annie Wilkes never swears, and that is exactly why she is terrifying. Stephen King invented a private vocabulary for her. Cock-a-doodle, dirty birdie. Oogie, she scolds Paul for foul language like a schoolteacher, then does things no schoolteacher would survive. The film kept that language almost untouched, which was a real risk for a horror release in 1990. Think about how easy it would have been to cut. Studio notes love making villains sound tough. Nursery words on a killer read as comedy on the page, and a nervous production would have swapped them for something harder. Instead, Kathy Bates played them completely straight. No wink, no camp. Annie genuinely believes she is the decent one in the room, and the polite little insults prove it. Her rules are not an act, they are her whole moral system, which is why breaking them gets a man's ankles broken. Here is the crazy part. The childish words do more work than any threat could. When Annie calls Paul a dirty birdie while holding a hammer, the gap between how she talks and what she is doing opens up like a hole in the floor. The scariest character of the year was the one who refused to say a bad word. Number 8. The Cake the movie refused what the film shows you is the polite version of the book. In King's novel, the injuries do not stop at the ankles. Annie takes an axe to Paul's foot and cauterizes the stump with a propane torch. Later, she removes his thumb and serves it to him on a birthday cake, standing upright like a candle. Her scrapbook, quietly kept, lays out a trail of deaths going back years. None of that reached the screen. The mutilation was cut, the cake was never filmed, and the scrapbook became a short, chilling glance rather than a full inventory. Here is what makes it interesting. Kathy Bates has said she was disappointed by how much the violence was toned down. Speaking alongside Reiner at a 35th anniversary screening, she made it clear she would have gone further, and that Reiner pulled some moments back because he felt they crossed from horror into something else entirely. That is a rare disagreement to hear out loud. The actress wanted more darkness. The director cut it because he thought the audience would stop believing in Annie and start laughing at her. The twist is that both of them are describing the same problem from different sides, and the compromise is why the film still works. The book removes pieces of a man. The film only bends him, and somehow that hurts longer. Number 7. The killer nurse people point to the most disturbing thing about Annie Wilkes is how ordinary her job was. For decades, writers and study guides analyzing misery have pointed to Janine Jones, an American nurse convicted in the death of an infant in her care and long suspected in the deaths of others. A carer who killed. Somebody trusted with helpless people, who used that trust as cover. That link is a widely repeated claim rather than something King has built a full public account of, so treat it as the reading it is. But it explains the design of the character. Annie is not powerful because she is strong. She is powerful because she has medical knowledge, painkillers, and a locked door, and because society already agreed to hand her vulnerable bodies. There is a second, better documented ingredient. King had years of experience with fans who felt they owned his choices, readers furious when a story did not go the way they wanted. Annie's rage over the death of Misery Chastain is not invented from nowhere. It is a version of letters he actually received. Here's the payoff. Blend a real category of medical killer with real reader fury, and you get a villain who never needs a mask. Monsters usually break in. This one already had the keys and a nursing certificate. Number 6. Annie Wilkes was cocaine. The darkest fact about misery is not on the screen. It is in the writing of the book. King has been open about the state he was in during those years. He was deep into addiction to alcohol and cocaine, working at a pace that should not have been possible, and largely hiding how bad it had become. He has described writing much of that period in a haze he can barely account for. Then came the interpretation that reframes the whole story. King has said misery is about cocaine, and that Annie Wilkes is his cocaine, his number one fan, the thing that praised him, needed him, kept him at the typewriter, and would happily have killed him. Read the plot with that in mind, and it stops being a horror premise. A writer is kept alive by the very thing destroying him, in a room he cannot leave, producing pages for an audience of one. He got sober in the years that followed, and he has written about how close it came. The book survived as a record of the fight. Here is the twist. Millions of readers thought they were reading about a crazed fan. They were reading a man's honest description of his own addiction, dressed as a thriller. The scariest character King ever wrote was already living in his house. Number 5. 15 weeks flat on his back. James Caan's biggest challenge on this film was doing nothing. Caan spent roughly 15 weeks of the shoot in that bed. Not 15 days. 15 weeks of lying still, strapped into an injured body, delivering long scenes with his head on a pillow while another actor moved freely around him. For most performers, that is tedious. For Caan, it was close to torture. His entire screen identity was built on movement and aggression, from Sonny Corleone onward. And he has said he genuinely suspected Reiner was playing a sadistic joke on him. because the director knew exactly how much he would hate holding still. Here's the crazy part. That frustration is the performance. Paul Sheldon's constant, boiling need to get up and do something is not technique. It is a physical actor going quietly out of his mind for months and being filmed while it happens. And it forced a different kind of acting out of him. With no body language available, everything moved to his eyes and his voice. Watch the manuscript burning scene, and you can see a man acting with almost nothing but a jaw and a stare. The role that made him unforgettable in 1990 is the one where he was not allowed to move. Number 4. The star who had already vanished by the time Misery was cast, James Caan, had spent years out of the picture entirely. After a run of major 70s work, Caan stepped away from acting for much of the 80s. He has spoken openly about what was happening in that stretch, including grief after his sister's death and a period of drug use that pulled him off screens and out of the industry conversation. When he came back late in the decade, he was no longer a first choice for anything. He was a name that used to be big. That is a very specific kind of Hollywood limbo, and it is usually permanent. So look at what he walked into. A film every major star had refused. A role that required him to stay motionless. A director best known for comedies. An unknown stage actress as his only scene partner. On paper, that is not a comeback vehicle. It is the last stop. Here is the payoff. When the film opened, the press treated it as a resurrection. Coverage at the time framed it as Hollywood's reputed bad boy resurfacing, and the performance put him back in serious work for the rest of his career. He took the part nobody else wanted, in a bed he could not get out of, and it gave him back the industry that had written him off. Number 3. The axe fight that changed everything. The most famous moment in Misery exists because two men refused to agree. William Goldman was one of the most respected screenwriters alive, and he loved the amputation from the novel. To him it was the spine of the story, the point where the reader understands that Annie is not bluffing. He fought to keep it, and he had already lost a director over it. Rob Reiner cut it anyway. On a final pass through the script, he replaced the axe and the torch with a block of wood and a sledgehammer and turned an amputation into 2 broken ankles. His reasoning was cold and precise. Show a woman sawing off a man's foot, and the audience simply hates her. Hatred is boring. It ends the relationship. Keep her inside the range of something recognizable, a nurse convinced she is helping, and the audience stays trapped in her logic, which is far worse. Goldman was angry about it at the time. He later wrote that he had been wrong and that Reiner's instinct was correct. Here is the twist. The scene Goldman fought for would have been remembered as gore. The scene Reiner forced on him is ranked among the most frightening moments in film history. The softer version turned out to be the crueler one. Number 2. Gelatin legs and a real sledgehammer. That hobbling scene is not camera trickery. It is sculpture, physics, and one genuine hammer. The effects team from NBEFX, with Howard Berger leading the work, built prosthetic versions of James Caan's legs, gelatin casts of his real limbs, wire armatures inside, PVC and hinged joints at the ankles, engineered so the false ankle would fold and hold a horrible new angle instead of snapping clean. Kathy Bates swung an actual sledgehammer, not a rubber prop. The force had to be real, because the hinge needed genuine impact to bend to roughly 90 degrees on camera, and Reiner shot it tight, extremely tight, following the hammer down into frame so the lens never had room to reveal the seam between prosthetic and person. Here's the detail that reframes the whole thing. Because the framing was so close, Caan did not need to be in the bed for the moment itself. The actor, who had spent 15 weeks unable to get up, was reportedly able to walk away while his legs were destroyed on camera. So the single most physical scene of his shoot is the one he could sit out, and the sound design and Bates's calm face did the rest. The audience swears they watched a man's bones break. They watched gelatin, wire, and a woman who had decided it was for his own good. Number 1. Life copied The Sledgehammer 9 years after Misery reached theaters. Stephen King lived the injury he invented. On the 19th of June, 1999, King was walking along a road near his summer home in Maine when a van driven by Brian Smith struck him. The damage was catastrophic. His lower leg was broken in at least 9 places. His hip was fractured, ribs were broken, his lung collapsed, and his scalp was torn open. Doctors initially discussed amputating the leg before deciding to stabilize the shattered bones with an external fixator, a metal frame drilled into him. He went through 5 operations in 10 days, then months of pain that made sitting for even 40 minutes unbearable. He was in the middle of writing his book on writing. He went back to it while broken, in a body that punished him for the work. Now put the two things side by side. Misery is about a writer smashed on a lonely road, dragged out of the wreck, trapped in his own damaged legs, and forced to keep producing pages through the pain. King published that in 1987. In 1999, he was living the outline. Smith was charged, pleaded to a lesser offense, and died in the autumn of the following year. Reports at the time noted the date fell on King's birthday. He imagined the worst thing that could happen to a writer. Then, he had to survive it. Bonus fact, the only Oscar King ever got here is the record nobody predicted from a snowbound two-hander. In 1991, Kathy Bates won the Academy Award for Best Actress for playing Annie Wilkes. More than 3 decades later, she remains the only performer to win an acting Oscar for a Stephen King adaptation. Not The Shining, not Carrie, not The Shawshank Redemption or Stand By Me. A Woman with a Pig and a Sledgehammer. And Annie refused to stay finished. William Goldman adapted the story for the stage, premiering at Bucks County Playhouse in 2012, then reaching Broadway in 2015 with Laurie Metcalf as Annie and Bruce Willis making his Broadway debut as Paul. That casting closed a loop. Willis had been on the long list of stars who turned the film role down years earlier. Critics largely praised Metcalf's Annie, while the production and Willis drew a cooler response, with several reviewers noting how much tension the story loses when a camera cannot cut away and trap you. The character kept traveling anyway. Lizzie Kaplan played a younger Annie in the series Castle Rock in 2019, extending a woman who was only ever meant to exist in one bedroom in Colorado. Every star said no to this story. It produced the only acting Oscar in King's entire screen history, and a villain who will not stop coming back. So look at what this film actually is. A project abandoned by its first director, refused by more than a dozen leading men, softened against its own screenwriter's wishes, and carried by an actress Hollywood had spent years replacing. Every single one of those setbacks made it better. And the strangest thread runs outside the frame. A writer trapped by his own addiction wrote a story about a writer trapped in a bed, then years later was hit on a country road and left with a leg broken in 9 places. The finished film hit its worst violence and became the only Stephen King adaptation to win an acting Oscar anyway. Which fact hit you hardest? The director who could not say action, the gelatin legs, or what happened to King in 1999? Tell me in the comments, because the answers here are always better than the script. If you want more buried production history like this, a like helps, subscribing keeps these coming, and the notification bell means you catch the next one early. The released movie is never the whole story.